Chris Fogarty, I don't remember how I found this book, but I found it. I've read it. You and I are going to talk about it a little bit. It is one of the most important books in Western English-speaking civilization that I know of. And just so people understand that there is a book review that they can look at. I'll just show this here at phibetaiota.net. And there's a book review here, Ireland, 1845-1850, The Perfect Holocaust. So, folks, in addition to this interview on video, there is a text interview. And I just want to say, I am deeply admiring of this because what it documents is that 5 million or more Irish citizens were murdered by the British Empire. And it also documents something I didn't know, was that the Irish were slaves before the blacks. That was fascinating for me. So let's just start with, tell us a little bit about who you are. And then the second question is, what got you to write the book?
Very good. My name is Chris Fogarty. I was born in Chicago. When I was 10 years of age, my family, my parents returned to Ireland with us, my siblings. We lived on a farm in County Roscommon. When I came back to Chicago in 1954, I became a laborer, a carpenter, a builder, eventually a civil engineer working throughout the world. Upon finishing a job in El Salvador, never having known my father's father, I thought I would learn something about him. I went to the Public Record Office in Kew outside London. He had been a British soldier, and I found the actual documents onto which he signed in 1857. My grandfather was born in 1839, died in 1923, long before I was born. So I found that the regiment, here's what shocked me. I found that the regiment that he joined in 1857, when he was a boy of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years of age, had removed the food from South County Galway. That was shocking to me because in schools on both sides of the Atlantic, I had learned about this potato famine, so-called Irish famine. And I had been taught, for example, by Marist brothers in Castlereagh, County Roscommon, the same thing. So it was consistent. There was no exception to that lie of famine. Everyone taught the same lie, and it proved to be a lie. So having discovered that one regiment had been removing the food from South County Galway, I continued researching, and I found that it took more than half the British Empire Army of the day, 67 regiments out of a total of 129 regiments, to starve Ireland by removing Ireland's abundant foods at gunpoint. So that's the basic story. Those troops were not in mutiny. They were following orders from London. Their commander-in-chief, General Sir Edward Blakeney, he led those food removal troops from the 1845 beginning all the way through the end of 1850, all the way through. He was a commander-in-chief of that Holocaust all the way through. We need labels for certain events in history. And for me, the one applicable to the Irish Holocaust is the word Holocaust, because it was reported as Holocaust at the time. The Cork Examiner newspaper, now the Irish Examiner, consistently reported it starting on May 4, 1846 as Holocaust. As a little aside here, genocide did not exist. It was not coined. The word genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin in post-World War II to tell the Congress about what he said was done by the Nazis to the Jews. So genocide is of recent coinage. It did not exist to ever be used at the time, but Holocaust did exist, and it was used to describe what the British were doing to the Irish.
You know, in your book and in my review, I include a copy of this brilliant map, which obviously you've updated over time. And what you show on this map is the mass graves, yes, as well as the locations of all of the British regiments. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about how you did the research and how you ultimately found so many mass graves across Ireland?
the people of Ireland are still whispering about the mass graves. They call them famine graves because that's what they were taught in school. Anyone who knows Irish history well knows that they're all Holocaust graves, but they're all from the same period, 1845, 1850, and they were mass graves, and they were generally buried outside consecrated ground. The Catholic Church at the time in Ireland were still so intimidated, having been executable upon sight for hundreds of years until 1828, they evidently were still very fearful because they could have told the truth, but they didn't. And they refused Christian burials to those starvelings. So most of the monuments that my wife and I have installed over mass graves are outside the walls of consecrated ground because they were not allowed to enter consecrated ground, which indicated in the Catholic faith that they had no souls. Being selected for death by the British government, they also had no souls and would not enter eternal life. That is a shocking, shocking position for the Catholic Church to have taken in those years, but it expresses the fear they had of the British government.
Well, let me, and I appreciate your brief answers with tight conclusions. One of the things that surprised me about this book, I didn't realize this, but under British law from like the 16th to the 19th century, the Irish were considered to be subhuman. You could kill an Irishman without penalty. Can you elaborate on the status of the Irish in the eyes of British law over those centuries?
Yes, actually 5 Irish families were granted a continuation of their legal personhood. But the entire Irish people otherwise were non-persons. They were under British rule, they were stripped of their legal personhood, making them non-persons to whom the law could not apply, except to punish them. But it could not be used by the Irish to defend themselves. Being non-persons, they were murderable at will of any English man, woman in Ireland.
Now, the other half of that is that the churches and the Irish leaders seem to have betrayed the Irish public. And the church in particular, I was raised as a Jesuit Catholic altar boy, which has led to many conflicts in my soul.
Yeah.
But how do you keep an entire nation? I mean, I've read another book called How the Irish Saved Western Civilization. And I've actually thought about Galway as one of my exile points, one of my exit strategy points. Galway is a beautiful place with a university I could work with. How did the British do this?
I must say, I don't know the answer to that question. All I know is that they have been successful. You will not get a passing grade in Ireland schools if on a test sheet you mention these crimes, this genocide by the British government. That will get you a failing grade. So all of Ireland's professors of history are there because they went along with the lie all the way through their own education. And one break in that, for example, is the ex-Marist brother, or the Marist brother who taught me. He was retirement in Strokestown, County Scommon, near Castlereagh, where he had taught for 50 years. In addition to a few trips teaching in Kenya, in Nigeria. He was asked by an ex-student, not me, but by another ex-student, brother, you now call it genocide. Why did you teach us all famine in school? And Brother Ender replied, I must say he replied completely unacceptably to me for a man of religion who did everything else with such dedication and honesty. He said, I had no choice. I had to teach the curriculum as provided to me by the government. That's one honest man's reply. The rest I cannot account for.
Well, I have 2 reactions to that. The first is one of the things that your book taught me, which I hadn't realized, was that Winston Churchill oversaw a genocide in India.
Yes.
As well. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, there were a number. There were 2 separate genocides in India, one in the 1700s and one during World War II. I had a discussion with a Madhusri Mukherjee, from Bangladesh, a professor who wrote a book about about Churchill's genocide of her people. And at the time, that was in Eastern India. It didn't become Bangladesh and East Pakistan until later. But she describes the murder of some 6 or 7 million people. The only difference between the genocide of her people and the genocide of the Irish is that Ireland today the map of Ireland is dotted with mass graves. There are thousands of them. I've marked some 200, well, 300, close to 300 of them. But in her case, she said there are no mass graves in Bangladesh and Eastern India today. They had a different way of disposing of the bodies. So there's no real, in the Churchill's genocide in Eastern India and Bangladesh, there's nothing physical today that they can point to.
Yeah, they like to burn the bodies. I'm also a huge fan of David Irving, who may well be one of the top historians, one of the top 3 historians for World War II. And I note with interest that Hitler never wanted to go to war with England, and that Churchill was bribed by the Rothschilds to go to war with England. And furthermore, that we murdered 11 million Germans after they surrendered. And these are things that strike me as fascinating. I mean, John Lewis Gaddis has written a book called Landscape of History, the bottom line of which is most history is a lie. So tell me a little bit about some of this negative hostility, and perhaps with reference to the examples you just gave me.
Yes, well, Radio Televisión is the state-owned communication system of Ireland. It essentially has a monopoly. Their radio show host, Joe Duffy, on his Radio 1 of Radio Televisión, contacted me about a memorial my wife and I installed outside RD, County Louth, over a previously unmarked Holocaust mass grave. It had been unmarked ever since it was filled, 1845 to 1850. The people are too afraid of government in Ireland to put a memorial over it. They asked me and my wife if we will do it for them. It is too dangerous for them. I don't know what the penalty to them would be, but the host of Radio 1 of Radio Televisión contacted me, Joe Duffy, and he was very upset about this memorial that is put up over a Holocaust mass grave. It had never been marked before. And it names the regiments that removed the food from that district. That might be what disturbs him and the Irish government so much. But he was so angry with me that he called me Trump. And then he had other people there to claim that there were no, in his words, famine victims buried there at all. And of course there were. They were brought out in cartloads from the RD workhouse of no fewer than 4 bodies at a time. I have that from people who've carried it forward and who had been going on pilgrimages to that mass grave ever since. The people of RD, County Louth, have gone there to pray for the souls of those murdered in that mass grave. They've gone there ever since, and including up to date. Joe Duffy brought in a historian who claimed that was not likely. He didn't know. He claims to be an officer of the County Louth Archaeological and Historical Society, but knows nothing about the current, recent history. Then another woman came on. This was all an ambush against me. Another woman came on the air to accuse the memorial that we installed about 4 years ago for having caused the violence in Northern Ireland from 1968 to 1998. Somehow that memorial that did not exist at the time is the cause of the violence of those years. So there's another smear. And then there was a young man who was recommended to me as a sculptor who would bring forward a more reverent kind of a memorial for the people. And I agreed to pay him €1,000 more than the 3,000 or 4,000 I'm already paying if he brought forward a better memorial. So he was on air and he called me a con man. I was waiting for his sketch of his proposed memorial. And instead of getting the sketch from him, he was on that show calling me a con man. So that's what goes on. Meanwhile, a senator came out from Ireland some years ago to Notre Dame, Indiana, to Notre Dame University, and I had heard about it, and we went out there distributing my then pamphlet, and everyone in the audience already had one when she showed up. Two of her companies called, asked me for a couple of copies. I gave them to them. They brought them to her in a room, and she came out 10 minutes later, and she started off with, first thing I want to make clear, the British government had nothing to do, the British Army had nothing to do with the starvation of Ireland. A comical feature of this is I was standing at the side of that huge auditorium, and as she said that, everyone looked up at her, looked down at the map in their hands, and then looked up at her again with their mouths open, because it was right there in front of them. That map was also on that pamphlet, and it showed which regiment removed the food from which part of Ireland. So that was that. Meanwhile, there are professors coming out from Ireland, and they seem to be focusing upon the ancient order of Hibernians to try to drive home to them the official word that it was a potato famine. I don't know why the Irish government is doing this, other than to say it seems to be evidence that after the election of 1918, which 77 seats, a huge majority, massive, almost a total, was pro Sinn Féin. They formed a government on December 21, 1919. They represented the elected representatives of the Irish people, but they were being imprisoned and murdered by the British government. The British government referred to that government of Ireland as an illegal assembly. Under King George then, the Fifth, they set up another competing parliament in Ireland, which many of us today now have taken to calling the Royal Dáil instead of Dáil Éireann. And that one was imposed on December 6th, 1921. All governments of Ireland since then have been successors to that government and not to the one that was the voted wishes of the Irish people in 1918.
You know, I find this fascinating. As it happens, I was in Scotland when they were taking the vote on secession of Scotland. And I was informed by several Scottish people that the British government violated the rules and called every pensioner prior to the vote and said that if you vote for secession from England, you will lose your pension, which is a lie. Yeah. Absolute lie. Now, I want to unpack this a little bit. First off, has anyone done forensics? Has anyone exhumed one of these mass grave sites and actually taken photographic evidence of the bones?
Not that I know of, but that's a very good question. We put up, the second one my wife and I put up was over the mass grave of the village of Lisnabinia, outside Ballymoe, County Galway. That village was wiped out. No, there were no survivors in those years. So we put up the memorial, because we didn't know the exact location of the mass grave. We put the memorial up beside where the village once had existed. But later that year, a daughter returned from overseas and was able to tell us where exactly on her father's farm the mass grave was. That in 1919, when he was first granted that land, an old English landlord's estate, that particular mass grave was in his most distant field, right beside the bog in soft ground. And that is why the people of Lisnabinia were buried there, because the ground was softer to dig. But she pointed out where the mass grave is, and her father had told her when he hit it with his plow. You see, bog gardens are a great place to grow crops. The soil is loose, very fertile, and it's ideal for tillage crops. So he plowed that in his first spring there, but he hid all these remains. Had it been only one, he would have arranged a Christian burial and sent it somewhere else. But there were so many that he stopped plowing, and he never plowed there again. And from then on, the family saved hay on that field. They plowed a land further up the hill that was much heavier, much harder to work. So they spent 50 years working on land that was much heavier, much harder to work, because they respected the mass grave.
Yeah, no, this is very interesting. Now, when you talk mass grave, what's your bottom line number for the lowest number to be a mass grave? Is it 10, 100?
That also is another great question. I don't think the local people would remember and mark a grave as a famine grave if it didn't have a substantial number. I would think something on the order of 30 or 40 or 50 would
All right,
probably be the
that's a good
minimum
number. That's a good number to have in mind. Now, have any of your memorials been removed or vandalized?
The local newspaper in Mullingar County, Westmeath, covered one memorial with a polyethylene film, and that was left there and photographed there. I have a photograph of it, but other people came along and ripped it off. That newspaper, the Westmeath Examiner, was calling for removal of that stone, of that memorial. There was no other memorial there. It would have been a mass grave with no marker if it had not been for that memorial.
If you had to go write the history of a piece of Scotland or Australia or Canada, what percentage of the truthful knowledge do you think would have to be acquired from oral history lore from people rather than from the libraries and the books as taught?
I must say, I'm pretty sure, sad to say, that the lore that is passed down through generations gets distorted. I think we have to go to official documents, and that's what I had to do. Even though I had heard that from the people in those years, there were books, very authoritative books, written on the starvation, the murder, the genocide of Ireland, and they all were plausible. And so I think we have to go to primary sources, especially search for the truth obliquely. Do not ask for records that show actual crimes, but look for for example, in a time when the food is being removed, look for the number of troops in that area at the time. Look for the occasional covert letter, which I did, and got a letter written by Lord Clarendon to Prime Minister John Russell about the removal of the food. Yes, and so you'll only get an occasional. But for example, all of the daily food removal records, they're all gone. They will never be recovered. They have been purged. But I prefer primary sources even better than, they tend to confirm local history, but local history tends to not be precise as to dates, as to names of individuals, as to number of troops. That's why I must use primary sources.
I want people to read your book. Now, in your book, you itemize 7 lies. And we don't need to go over all of them, but would you like to just outline, as we draw to a close on this, what some of the big lies are that have been perpetuated throughout history by the Irish government, the British government, the American government, the Catholic Church, and the Academy?
Yes, would you mind reading them off? I don't have them in front
I don't
of
mind
me.
reading them off at all. And I'll just read them off, and then I'll offer you a concluding commentary. So lie number 1, potato famine. Lie number 2, famine. And what I drew from the book was that Ireland had plenty of food that was not a potato. And it was simply the failure of the potato that was a potato crop failure, but that would not have led to the famine of the Irish. And then lie number 3, no food left Ireland while the people starved. And you've documented that most ably, and I note that your map has all of the exit ports through which the food was taken out. Lie number 4, the British Army had nothing to do with it. Your book documents how that was precisely why the British Army was present. And I remember one quote where they would have nothing to do if it weren't for escorting the food out of Ireland.
Yes.
Lie number 5, it was the rich Irish starving the poor Irish. And you do a great job of showing how the middlemen were, in fact, not the owners. And I love, there's one place there where you talked about how the rich people in England were spending their Irish provenance around the world. Lie number 6, most landlords were Catholic. And lie number 7, the Irish starved despite, not because of the law. I want to conclude with this because I really want people to go buy this book and read it. And if they can't buy and read the book, they should at least read my summary of review of the book. And I'll tell you why this matters. In the recent Russian witch hunt against President Trump, it has now been established that it was the British Empire that collaborated with John Brennan and Gina Haspel in treason against our president.
Yes.
It is now known that Great Britain and Israel are the two enemies inside the gate in the United States of America. And I think this is going to be the big revelation that comes out after President Trump's election. We're done with the British Empire. The Commonwealth needs to be broken up and be free, starting with Ireland and Scotland. So I'll end my PN there. So with utmost respect for the work you have done, I mean, this book is what history should be.
Yes.
The truth and the moral value of the truth. So
Yes.
Close us out with your thoughts on the book, how it has been received, how it has been censored, and what your hope is for future public understanding of the truth about Ireland's sad relationship with England.
For 20 years, the columnist with the Irish American paper here in Chicago. Upon being asked to do an article, a column on the famine, I told the truth. And I received a one-sentence reply as it hit the streets, and that is, your column will no longer be necessary. There was a major Irish government push on for the British to conceal this, and all of Irish academia is behind it. The people who like this book are those with some basic honesty and with sometimes a little courage, but the entire establishment is adamantly and in fact nearly violently opposed to it. We had many repercussions, an attempt to destroy reputations, framing for crimes and other things that we'll do separately. But this Holocaust must be kept quiet, evidently, because it would interfere with the ongoing genocides by the same empires. And sad to say, our own government founded in freedom, has now become taken over by imperialists. It is so desperately sad.
You know, I just noticed a news article on how Boris, your deep state prime minister in England, not your deep state, but the prime minister in England is now trying to cancel the British Bill of Rights. And I was one of the first who called out this fake pandemic and pointed out that there is no such thing, that it is in fact a manufactured media mongering, naked short sell-off of the global economy. So as we look around us today in 2020, and we look at the lies that are being told by all governments, including particularly Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and to a lesser extent, but still importantly, the United States, what we come down to is my motto, which is the truth at any cost lowers all other costs. I salute you, sir, for one of the most extraordinary books that I've had the privilege to read in the past 40 years. God bless you. Thank you.
Anyone can get it by contacting me at either email fogartyc@att.net, that's FOGARTYC@att.net, or on Amazon.com.
You have a website also, which I will put in the description.
That's fine. I must say, my book supersedes that website. It's been refined quite a bit, but the website does contain all the basic facts. Yes.
Well, then let me just say, if you want to strike a blow for freedom, people, and demonstrate your intellectual integrity, buy this book.
Thank you so much.
God bless you, sir.